This is Friesland, and it's in this part of the world that we can still hear the modern language that we believe sounds closest to what the ancestor of English sounded like 1500 years ago.
En als we dan maart nog even bezoeken, maart hebben we toch wel een aantal dagen. Het worden dagen.
Some of his words might sound familiar, like 3 and 4, frost and freeze.
Een temperatuur zomer bij de 3 of de 4 graden, geen frost, het zal net vriezen.
Mist and blue.
Vierders de kans op mist. En dan moon. Een dag met flink wat zinnen. Blauw in de lucht.
The reason we can recognize these words is that modern Frisian and modern English can both be traced back to the same family, the Germanic family of languages. And some words have stayed more or less the same down the centuries. Butter, bread, cheese, meal, sleep, boat, snow, sea, storm. The West Germanic tribes who invented these words were a warlike, adventurous people. They'd been on the move through Europe for the best part of 1,000 years and now had settlements in what we would call the lowlands of northern Europe, Holland, Germany and Denmark. But they were still greedy for land, ready to move on. This is the island of Terschelling. The English coast is about 250 miles to the southwest behind me. It was from these islands and the low-lying Frisian mainland that in the 5th century a Germanic tribe, part of the family that also contained Jutes, Angles and Saxons, made sail to look for a better life. And they took their language, our language, with them. The Germanic tribes weren't the first to invade our shores. More than 500 years before, the Romans had also come by sea to impose their will. Now their empire had crumbled, and they'd abandoned these islands, leaving the native tribes, the Britons or Celts, to their fate. This is Pevensey Castle, an ancient Roman fort that used to stand on the very shoreline of the south coast. The chronicle of the period reports that in the year 491, Germanic invaders laid siege and slaughtered the Celts who'd taken refuge here. Not one of them was left alive. Other Celts did survive the invasion, 1 million or more of them in England, but they were a broken people. The clue to their fate lies in the word the Germanic tribes used to describe them. It was Wilas, a name that lives on in our modern language as Welsh. 1,500 years ago, it meant both foreigner and slave. The Celts became servants and followers, second-class citizens. The only way up was to become part of the invaders' tribes, to adopt their culture and their language. The Celts and their language were pushed to the margins. Only a handful of words from the Celtic languages survive into modern English. In the north, where I come from, we have crag, meaning rock, coombe, meaning deep valley, and dialect words like brat and brock for badger. There are traces in place names. The Tor in Tropenna, spelled as Torpenhow, a neighbouring village to my own, that comes from the Celtic for peak. The Car of Carlisle means a fortified place. In the south, they left us the names of Thames and Avon, Dover and London. But these were fragments. The language that prevailed was that of the victors. By the end of the 6th century, these Germanic tribes occupied half of mainland Britain. They had divided into a number of kingdoms: Kent, Sussex, Essex and Wessex, denoting the settlements of southern, eastern and western Saxon tribes; East Anglia, named after the Angles who gave England its name; Mercia in the Midlands, Northumbria in the north. Throughout these areas, many modern place names come from that settlement, or use the words they brought. We live with them. We live in them every day. The ing in modern place names means the people of. Ton, as in Wickton where I come from, means enclosure or village. Ham means farm, which might surprise one or two Tottenham supporters. The Germanic tribes now settled around the country all spoke their own dialects. From among them would emerge one language, Anglo-Saxon or Old English, and we all speak it every day.
Without five strikers, none of them can really finish. Armstrong, Everson,
natural
Sheridan.
born, are they? We just need some youth and pace, really.
Examine the language you use today and you'll still find hundreds of words from a language over 1,500 years old. Keywords ranging from the names we give family members to numbers. English took its first steps away from its tribal roots with the revival of Christianity.
Nu we schulen herian, he often reaches weird. Methodes mikte and his mood gethunk.
Let us praise the King of Heaven, the power of the Creator and his conception, the work of the glorious Father who created every wonder, the eternal Lord.
He often to proof. Harlig Schipend.
In 597, the monk and prior Augustine led a mission from Rome to Kent. Around the same time, Irish monks of the Celtic Church were establishing a presence in the north. Within a century, Christians built churches and monasteries. This is St. Paul's in Jarrow, parts of which date from the 7th century. Faith and stone weren't the only things the Christian missionaries brought to the country. They brought the international language of the Christian religion, Latin. Latin terms became part of the English word hoard. Altare became altar. Apostolus became apostle. Mass, monk and verse and many others all come from the Latin. This would become a pattern of English, the layering of words taken from different source languages. And from Latin too, the English took their script. The Anglo-Saxons, Frisians and Jutes, who would become the English, hadn't brought script as we know it with them, but runes. The runic alphabet was made up of symbols formed mainly of straight lines, so that the letters could be carved into stone or wood. Those were their media, rather than parchment or paper. Though this is a short poem, most examples of runic writing that survive suggest runes were mainly used for short, practical messages or graffiti. The Latin alphabet was different. With its curves and bows, it allowed words to be easily written using pen and ink onto pages of parchment or vellum, which, gathered together into a book, could be widely circulated. Christianity brought the book to these shores. Verbum, the word. Soon a native culture of scholarship began to flower, a culture based on Latin and on writing. The magnificent Lindisfarne Gospels were created in the 8th century on the island of Lindisfarne, just off the northeast coast. A few miles south, at the monastery of St. Paul's in Jarrow, the great English monk and scholar Bede, born and educated in Northumbria, began writing the first ever history of the English-speaking people. He wrote, of course, in Latin, the language of scholarship. The prevailing language among the people was still Old English, but Latin, this powerful medium, was now amongst them. Now, Old English was written down, using the Latin alphabet, while retaining some of the old runes as letters. From the 7th century, we find English itself written on parchment in a language and a script which we can just about recognize as our own.
Father User thu arth in hiofnu, siga halgad noma din, to kumath richa din, si willow din swa is in hiofne and in eortho. Chlaf userne of wislich selos today, and forgifus schulda usra, swa we forgifon schuldgem usem, and inled usi in costum.
With writing, Old English stole a march on other languages spoken in Europe at the time. Prayers were recorded and books of the Bible translated. The laws of the land were written down, and the language soon became capable of recording and expressing an increasingly wide and subtle range of human experience. Latin and Greek had created great bodies of literature in the classical past. In the East, Arabic and Chinese were being used in the 8th and 9th century as languages of poetry. But at that time, no other language in the Christian world could match the achievement of the Beowulf poet and his anonymous contemporaries. Old English was flourishing. The adventure was underway. But while the seeds of English had come from these Frisian shores in the 5th century, so now, in the late 8th century, a potential destroyer was preparing his battle fleet 500 miles or so to the north. In the late 8th century, the Latin-based culture of scholarship, which had grown up in places like Lindisfarne and which had also been the cradle of Old English, faced extinction from across the sea. These ruins are of the medieval monastery that stood on the island of Lindisfarne. It was the Vikings who sacked and burnt the religious centre that stood here before. To these pagan pirates rampaging out of their longships in 793, this great centre of Christian piety and scholarship, a pivotal place in the survival of the Word and the Gospels, was no more than an undefended treasure house. The jewels that graced the books of the church became baubles around a Viking's neck. Today the Vikings may seem romantic, reenacting their rituals a good day out. Over 12 centuries ago, their arrival was not so cheerful. To many, it seemed to signal the end for civilization. A year after razing Lindisfarne, the Vikings returned and sacked Jarrow, the abbey, where Bede had been the greatest scholar in one of the finest libraries in Christendom. This stronghold of the Latin word, where English was also being written down, uniquely among European dialects, was burned to the ground, its books with it. It was the start of 70 years of attack, during which the Vikings savaged this eastern half of the country. Few stories survive of exactly where and when they attacked, perhaps chillingly because few were left to tell the tale. At first, the raiders went home with their plunder. Then they decided to take the land itself. In 865, the Vikings landed a great army south of here in East Anglia. Within 5 years, the Viking invaders, who were now called Danes, controlled the north and east of the country. Of the old Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, only Wessex still held out. Old Norse, the language of the conquerors, was spreading throughout the land. Old English potentially faced the same fate as the Celtic language it had supplanted, virtual oblivion. English was in need of a champion, and it found one. King Alfred's statue stands here in Winchester, the capital of his ancient kingdom of Wessex. He's the only monarch in our history to be known as the Great, and he's often been hailed as the saviour of England. That may be debatable, as the idea of a single unified England didn't really exist in Alfred's day. What is certain is that he was a great defender of the English language.